I'll click. Is it Libby Hinsley?
Yes.
Yay!
Yeah, you got it. Good job.
Okay. Right. Because you told me that it's like Heinz, like the ketchup, and now I'm remembering.
Right.
Okay. Let's just dig right in. And at any time, you know that we have an editor and you can start a sentence again, or you can tell me if I'm misunderstanding something in my question. Like you can always tell me, well, like don't be afraid to correct me on something when I ask you a question.
Okay.
Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast, Libby. It's so great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. I am excited to have this conversation with you.
I am so glad that we get to talk about yoga and hypermobility because this is something that comes up all the time in the Connected Yoga Teacher group. It comes up in yoga teacher trainings. It comes up in yoga classes all over. But before we get there, tell us first, what is the work that you do and what's the work that you've been doing lately on your book?
Okay. So I'm a physical therapist, but I was a yoga teacher first. And my teaching yoga is kind of what led me into physical therapy. And I've been a PT now for 10 years, and I'm a yoga therapist as well. And I specialize in treating hypermobility disorders and hypermobility syndromes. And a part of that is because in my clinical practice of treating primarily injured yogis and injured yoga teachers, turns out they all have hypermobility, or a great many of them do. And then over the last few years, I actually discovered that I actually have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So like my whole personal and professional worlds just have brought me into this real focus on hypermobility, understanding these conditions, understanding how to treat them. And so in the last year, I've been writing a book about it, and it's called Yoga for Bendy People. And it hopefully will kind of push the needle on the quality of conversation that we're having about hypermobility in the yoga community and help shed some light on what is actually a pretty complicated topic. Might help give some direction to teachers, all teachers, as well as practitioners who have hypermobility.
That's amazing. Can you define for us what is hypermobility? Let's start there.
Yeah, so hypermobility is just a word that describes a joint's ability to move more than is normal. So for every joint in the body, we have normal ranges of motion that have been established based on, how normal humans move. And hypermobility just describes someone who moves more. You can have that in just a couple joints. You can have that in a whole lot of joints. There are a lot of ways to have hypermobility. And the thing is, it's not pathological in and of itself. So there are a few different things that could lead someone to have joints that move more than is normal, bigger ranges of motion. It could be the shape of your bones and the way that the particular bones come together. But when we get into situations where hypermobility is caused by a genetic difference in connective tissue, that is when it's more likely to be symptomatic and problematic. And that's when we start to call it a hypermobility syndrome. Okay, and so that has to do with a difference in the structure and or function of collagen fibers in the body. And all of those collagenous connective tissues, tendons, ligaments, fascia, joint capsules are made largely out of collagen. And so when you have, I'm just going to call it sort of floppy collagen, floppy connective tissues, then you don't get that support from your passive structures. And so that starts to create some problems, not just musculoskeletal problems, but actually a whole wide array of symptoms across a lot of systems of the body.
And then you said that you've been diagnosed with, what did you call it?
Yeah, hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So that is one of many conditions where hypermobility is a feature. So when we say hypermobility syndrome, that's kind of a generic term to just describe some condition where there's hypermobility and there's symptoms associated with it. And a couple of the most common ones are hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos. Now, Ehlers-Danlos is a bigger umbrella of 14 different subtypes. And they're all, most of them are pretty rare conditions, but the one that is not rare at all is hypermobile type. And it's not a rare condition, but it's not well understood genetically yet. And it's also massively underdiagnosed. And so that is one diagnosis of hypermobility syndrome. And then another one that looks almost identical to it, but that doesn't meet all the specific criteria for diagnosis, is called hypermobility spectrum disorder. And that's a more general kind of term to describe people who are symptomatic and are bendy and have a wide range of symptoms that we can get into if you'd like, but that don't really meet that criteria for that Ehlers-Danlos. And there's a lot of confusion between those things. And it's because it is confusing, honestly, it's very confusing. But the thing I want to drive home is that, if someone has hypermobility and they have a bunch of symptoms, it doesn't really matter what the label is. The symptoms are what, we're dealing with. And I really believe yoga can be a powerful tool to improve the quality of life for people who have hypermobility. Whatever their label is, or if they don't ever get a label, we can talk about the pros and cons of that as well. But hypermobility spectrum disorder is not a lesser diagnosis than hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos. That is often a misconception.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. What did you say?
They're just different labels. Yeah.
That's so good. That's so helpful for you to clarify this. And so I know over the years as a yoga teacher, different people, I would see people, let's say not even in a yoga class, I'd just be somewhere where someone was demonstrating flexibility or maybe hypermobility, and someone else might comment and say, "Oh my gosh, you're so bendy, you should go to yoga." So, what are your thoughts on that?
Exactly. That is exactly the thing that sets us up for this conundrum we're in yoga, like a yoga culture that continues to really glorify and praise and kind of reward, with positive feedback, people who are just genetically hypermobile. And it turns out a lot of those people are struggling with a whole lot of different challenges that, it creates this bit of confusion. And I've lived that for many years, where people are like, wow, you're so good at yoga, just because you can kind of get your body into these shapes. And inside I'm going, but I'm so confused because my body hurts all the time and I'm having all these other issues. And how am I good at yoga? I just don't understand. I remember being confused about that, 20 years ago when I was taking yoga classes. There's a disconnect with what we consider it means to be good at yoga is very much tied to an aesthetic that glorifies hypermobility. And it's a problem. Yeah. Not only is it a problem because it kind of encourages bendy people to exploit that because they're getting positive feedback for it, but it also is intimidating for just your normal human bodies who might really benefit from yoga, but feel intimidated because then they don't think they're good at yoga. Right. So it's like across the whole board, I think it's unfortunate. But you mentioned flexibility and hypermobility. Flexibility and mobility are two different terms. And I want to just clarify those real quick because they're often used interchangeably. And, the definitions of those terms are really going to depend on who you ask. So like if there's a research article or a book written and people are talking about these things, my hope is that they just define their terms well, because they're not always defined the same way. So just like to put that out there. But in the hypermobility world, what I see most commonly is that flexibility is determined by like the tone of your nervous system and the stretchiness of your muscles to allow range of motion to happen at a joint. Whereas mobility is really talking about the joint itself, the mobility that the collagenous connective tissues allow, like the joint capsule and the ligaments and the tendons. So the mobility really has to do with joints, and it doesn't have to do so much with muscles. Okay, so what's tricky about this is that a lot of hypermobile people whose joints move a lot, who have floppy connective tissue, that's kind of the term we'll go with, floppiness, they have really tight muscles.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It is. And that tension in their muscles is very often their pain driver. It is really a big piece of, their symptomology in their musculoskeletal stuff.
Can you give us some information as to why the muscles are so tight then?
Yeah, there are a few different reasons. Okay, so if we step back and kind of look at, all right, there are muscles and then there's connective tissue. All right, and those are never really separate, right? So in a muscle, every muscle cell is surrounded by a layer of fascia. Every bundle of muscle cells, fascia. Every muscle belly, fascia. Okay, there are layers and layers and layers of fascia in a muscle unit, and those layers of fascia actually are continuous with the tendon, which is continuous with the bone. And so this collagenous connective tissue is intermingled with muscle tissue. You can't separate them out, but even though they're made of different stuff. And so we could think of that as passive and active parts of the kind of myofascial system or the musculoskeletal system. Passive parts are non-contractile parts, or at least minimally contractile. Because there's some fun stuff about fibroblasts that are the cells that make collagen. Turns out fibroblasts are actually contractile, and it's mind-blowing and crazy. But anyway, they actually make collagen, and they make all of the other components of connective tissue as well. But at any rate, let's talk about those as passive, because they're less contractile or very minimally contractile, where the active ones, the muscles, are contractile. All right, so we have this mix of active and passive structures that support mobility and movement and strength and all the things, our movement. Well, when you have a passive structure that's floppy, that doesn't hold tension, it doesn't hold the necessary tension to transmit forces across joints, to integrate movement, like, the tension of your passive connective tissues is how it provides integrity to your system. Okay, it's called tensegrity. And it's a cool concept. It's like integrity of this body actually comes from a tensional system. And so when the floppy passive structures can't hold tension, can't support you, then your active structures have to really bump it up, and they have to work double time to provide that stability. And so those muscles are contracting all the time just to try to hold you together, because it's actually collagen's job to hold you together. It's the glue of the body. And when it's not quite up to the task because of its difference genetically, then the active structures are really having to compensate a lot. So you get a lot of muscle fatigue and a lot of over contraction. So that's one reason. But then there are other reasons too. And one of them has to do with the status of the bendy person's nervous system. So hypermobile people tend to have nervous systems, autonomic nervous systems, that live in a sympathetic state. They're kind of in sympathetic overdrive. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them may be that they tend to have larger amygdala. They have different brain structures, and the amygdala is part of the brain that is really involved with a fear and stress response. And there's some cool research that shows bendy people actually have enlarged amygdala. And so that may be related to this sympathetic overdrive. So that's one thing. And they tend to have a lot of anxiety and kind of like a hypervigilant nervous system. That equals muscle tension for anybody. Yeah, so we've got a couple different things compounding on each other that create a situation of bendiness and a feeling of tightness, a feeling of tension. And I always say, the classic image of the hypermobile yogi is the person dropping into a split or in some really deep posture, complaining about how tight she is. And I've seen it so many times, and it's really like visually so weird. It's like, wow, this person is doing this amazing, like really difficult thing, but while they're there, they're talking about how tight they feel. And that's it.
This is fascinating. And it's bringing up a lot of questions for me, because I feel like the general message, and we know that general messages don't work with individual people, but the general message I usually hear is, okay, if you're hypermobile, the one and only answer, and I'm exaggerating this, is to strengthen your muscles. But this doesn't really go along with what you're saying if the muscles are holding a pile of tension.
Well, they're holding a pile of tension, but they really want to be stronger. So what's another kind of counterintuitive mind twist about muscle tension is that very often muscles are tense in response to instability or in response to relative weakness. And as those muscles get stronger, they get less tense. because tension isn't like a measure of strength. It's a dysfunction in a tension kind of way. So a tense muscle doesn't contract well. It doesn't yield well. Okay, it's just kind of contracting all the time. And so a lot of its contractile power is used up all the time. So I get so tired, and it gets, chemically irritated, because muscles that are contracting all the time don't get good blood flow. And then they kind of build up this, what I call a painful chemical soup, in the local tissues that is irritating, and that increases our pain. And so it's this whole cycle of events. So yes, strength training is the number one best friend for bendy people from now on forever. But that's not the only thing that can help them. But it is important. And I always do recommend it, strength training and stability training.
Okay, this is so good. Thank you for explaining that, because my brain all of a sudden was like, wait, is this the right thing to do? So what do we do then if we think that we might be hypermobile? Who do we go see? Do we stop going to yoga? Do we stop trying to do yoga poses? What are some of the things you tell people to do?
Well, if someone thinks that they might be hypermobile and have some symptoms related to it, I guess I can describe some of the most common symptoms just to see if it's, rings bells for people. Because very often people are walking around with kind of chronic nagging things that they've never really connected the dots about. But what's a classic presentation of someone with a hypermobility syndrome would be musculoskeletal stuff, including either joint dislocations or subluxations, like joints that just kind of don't quite stay in place. Labral tears are pretty common in the shoulders and the hips. The biggest one is going to be sacroiliac joint pain. That's I've almost never seen a bendy person who doesn't have that. It's really hard to find a person with a syndrome that doesn't have SI joint pain. Patellofemoral pain is really common. Pelvic organ prolapse is really super common. Hernia, abdominal hernias, things like that. So those would be, and muscle pain, fibromyalgia. Actually, there's some research that shows up to 70% of people who have a fibromyalgia diagnosis have joint hypermobility. And it's so prevalent. Hypermobility is so prevalent in people with fibromyalgia that a lot of experts in this field kind of have started to think that fibromyalgia may be actually a misdiagnosis. And actually what's going on is this bigger connective tissue thing. So that's an example. So myofascial pain and all the other stuff. And then the other pieces that often go along with it that also lead people to yoga practice for really good reason is this hypervigilant nervous system, this really high prevalence of anxiety and ADHD, and a stronger post-traumatic stress response. Really just all those, pieces that reflect a very heightened sympathetic tone and nervous system dysregulation. And so that's very commonly a piece of it. And then the other parts are a lot of digestive issues like irritable bowel or even just food sensitivities. That's really common because the gut lining is actually made largely of collagen. And so where there's collagen, there's some impairment, there's some floppiness, and the tight gap junctions that, line your gut, they're not tight, they're kind of wobbly and loose. And so there's a propensity for leaky gut. And then there's also a really common comorbidity of mast cell activation disorders, which is where you have a strong histamine response. People break out into rashes and hives really easily, or they're very sensitive to adhesives and they get rashy and itchy. Sometimes even with heated yoga that might stimulate that. And then there's dizziness, and the dizziness usually has to do with some autonomic dysfunction called dysautonomia. Dysautonomia is problems with the blood pressure and heart rate regulation. And so a lot of bendy people get dizzy, and it's because in orthostatic, or they have a hard time being upright. So there's orthostatic difficulty. And when they stand up, their heart rate goes way up, and or their blood pressure goes way down. So one of those things. And those are all the most common kind of spread of symptoms that people very often would have no reason to think are connected, but they are. They're all part of the syndrome.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, I would think with that huge list, you wouldn't be tying them all back to this. It's also making me wonder how many people are walking around that are hypermobile, and is it, I guess you explained this at the beginning, like not always is it an issue.
It's
Uh,
not always an issue. It's really
right.
not always a problem. And the prevalence of it is really hard to estimate, and different studies put it at different places. But the largest prevalence I've seen is an estimate of 20%. But of the general population, that's a lot. That's a lot. But are all those people symptomatic? Do they all have a hypermobility syndrome? I don't know. It's just so hard to say, because it isn't well understood and it's not well diagnosed. And I think a ton of people are walking around with undiagnosed hypermobility spectrum disorder or hypermobile EDS. And a lot of them are at yoga. I think hypermobility is way overrepresented in yoga compared to the regular population, just because it's nice to feel successful at an activity. And again, there are a lot of physical kind of challenges and mental health challenges that may lead someone to yoga for really good reasons. And yoga has a lot to offer this population. It's just that when we get into yoga, if we're practicing in a way that really emphasizes just increasing mobility to no end, like our verbal cues, our assists, everything about yoga so commonly pushes people to go as far as they can in a posture as if that's the goal. And that is not going to be helpful for a hypermobile person. A hypermobile person, needs to back away from the edge, just don't go to the edge. Stay away from it, and kind of put into place some different principles of practice, so that the practice actually is designed to be very supportive of this person. So often when we're talking about hypermobility in yoga, we kind of hone in on, okay, well, how can the bendy person keep practicing asana in the same way, which is very, still very popular stuff, this fast-paced, power, fitness oriented, sweaty. How can we keep doing that with less injury? All right. And that's a great conversation. I'm a fan of that. I'm a fan of decreasing injury. But it's not that interesting of a conversation to me. I think there's a much bigger one to be had, which is, okay, let's make the practice about the practitioner. Right? Instead of trying to push this practitioner into this certain type of practice, let's just build a practice that is actually for this person, that's about this person, and that really supports that person. So that's what my book is aiming to do, to lay out what are the principles of practice that not only don't injure these people, but actually really helps them to have better body awareness. That's one of the things I didn't mention, poor proprioception, better body mapping, brain and body communication, better motor control, better stability, better regulation, better focus, better connection to your heart's purpose, like all these different elements, and better self-care. So I have a whole chapter on yama and niyama as guidelines for self-care for anyone living with a chronic health condition. But all those are relevant to the bendy practitioner, not just how to micro bend your elbows so you don't hyperextend. I mean, how long are we going to talk about that? Cool, but let's go way beyond that.
This is fascinating. Okay, so we'll definitely add your book to our list. I think for all yoga teachers and quite possibly all yoga practitioners, I feel like it sounds like we could all gain something from it. So what are some of the components in your book where you think, you know what, these pieces really help to, like, I love what you said, to support the practitioner instead of making the person fit into the yoga practice. Let's make the yoga practice fit that person. What are some of the things that you've learned about?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the biggest mindset shift. So I have, talk a lot about just mindset. What's yoga for? We have to step back and ask that. And you're right. This is for all yoga teachers, this book, to reflect on what is it we're practicing for? What's this whole thing about? And we so easily miss that, or we kind of forget that in our quest for fitness type yoga stuff. we can kind of just miss the ball completely. So coming back to that and making the practice less about the practice and more about the practitioner, what we come up with is basic principles like smaller movements, smaller movements. And part of, backing away from the edge that I mentioned is an interesting sort of debate or conversation about range of motion. So the thing is, when you have a lot of range of motion at a joint, it's not entirely true that the range of motion is really bad, like you should never go there. Now, some people, to go to their edge, they'll dislocate a joint. Okay, well, let's not ever go there, right? We don't want that. But the bigger issue is that it's very difficult to control your movement through that large of a range. That's the real issue here. And especially with hypermobile people, they tend to not be so great at motor control, which is steady movement throughout a range. They don't have great proprioception and they don't have great joint stability through a range. So the way we cultivate that is to back up and do smaller movements and cultivate good motor control here in a smaller range. And then we, over time, maybe we increase the range, but not at the expense of the motor control. Okay, so smaller movements is a really big piece. My philosophy on it is that the range actually is a problem. There's no benefit in going to your end range. If you're hypermobile, you'll never lack range of motion. There's no risk. You know what I mean? You'll always have more than other humans, and you don't need to go there. And it's going to be more problematic for you probably than helpful. Now, that's different if you're actually a circus performer. Right? Like if your vocation requires you to train stability in that range, that makes sense. But if you're a yoga practitioner, that doesn't make sense because yoga doesn't care about your range of motion, right? That is not a goal of yoga. It's a goal of circus arts. So I think there are a lot of reasons to just back off in smaller movements. That's one principle. The other one is slower movements. We have got to slow it down because slower movements give you a chance to practice motor control. Like that is, you have to work so much harder as a bendy person to move slowly through a range than, flinging yourself around with momentum. Momentum is easy. That's not a problem. It's the control that's hard. And it's like, oh, it's really hard for bendy people to slow down. They're like, this is hard. Like, I know. Isn't that awesome? And so that's where it's at. It also gives us a chance to pay attention and to start getting the information from the body about how it actually feels to move. Because that's the other piece I didn't mention. There's so many pieces of it, is that bendy people have a hard time discerning and interpreting the information, like the cues that their body is giving them. And that's why they're so prone to overdo it, to go too far, to overdo it. And then they're not sure they're doing that in the moment because they don't get the information, but then they feel it the next day, right? And so slowing down helps us to start to listen to more subtle cues in the body, that the body's communicating to us about what's going on in the body. And we have to really focus because that's a challenge for bendy people. It's a challenge for the way that our brains are and the way they're wired up to talk with the body. We have to practice that. And it's common that a bendy person doesn't really feel anything until like it hits them over the head. It's like, so we need to start noticing the cues before we get to that point.
These are so good. And as you're saying this, what's popping into my brain are the moments as a yoga teacher watching someone in class really fling their leg or their arm over and then look at you like, yeah, what else do you have? This, I'm not feeling anything in this, or exactly. I can do this, and bringing them back to those smaller, slower movements is where I always went with them then. And it was hard then for them to do that.
It is hard to do that. And there's, someone has to be interested in doing that. But again, it depends on why are they at yoga? And at what point are they going to kind of shift their focus and be willing to to integrate mind and body. That's essentially what we're talking about, right? Rather than flinging yourself around, like sort of having this out of body experience, get your awareness in the body and start to feel it. That's the project for the bendy person, but you have to be willing, and it is not easy. And it's not sexy the way that
Do you have, right, do you have anything that you talk to yoga students or your PT clients about when they're dealing with hypermobility? And it's prevalent in different places where we look. Like being bendy is cool, especially in yoga spaces. So, is there anything that you tell them to convince them of this that would be kind of quick and get them on board? Like, this is going to feel better.
Yeah, I just tell them, when you change the way you're practicing, you're going to feel better. And so it's either you got to, there's like this crossroads that the bendy yogi gets to, and I'm talking about the person who's been symptomatic and is really having challenges. And this was me for 10 years. I was in daily pain directly related to my yoga practice. So I get it. I have absolutely been there, and I would never have changed my practice until I was ready to. So I get it, have compassion for that. But so there's this crossroads, and I tell people, you just decide, do you want to look cool in yoga, or do you want to feel better? And that's it. And you get to make that choice, and you can make it now, or you can make it in 10 years. Like, in my case, I waited a long time to make that decision, and I suffered a lot along the way. What were they, horrible injuries? No, but they made life less awesome. Like, they were daily nagging things that didn't need to be happening. So that's the crossroads. And, I always just ask people to reflect, what is it about? Why are you practicing yoga? And I remind people, your yoga practice is actually for you. And that usually really kind of wakes people up a bit, like, oh, you mean this isn't a performance for someone else? This is actually for me, and it's for my life. It's about my life, and that's what yoga wants this to be, for you, and to lead you to a, more easeful, purposeful life.
I love this so much. I love the yoga's for you. And the question, do you want to look cool or do you want to feel better? That's a great question. I know what it feels like to have an ego and be in a yoga class and think, oh, look at that person over there. I wonder if I could move like that or bend like that. I get it. So,
Totally.
yeah.
I was that person. Like I said, for years, I would show up to yoga class in my, sacroiliac support belt with shredded shoulders. I mean, I would not skip a chaturanga. I really was that person. So I do have great compassion for that. And I'm also very grateful that I was able to turn it around, that I was introduced to a way of practicing yoga, 12 years ago or so, that really changed things for me, and that has made my life better.
Is there anything that you've been learning about as you write this book, as you do this research, as you work with people, where you're like, wow, this is amazing, or wow, I wish I would have known this much earlier on?
Oh, all of it, all of it. I wish I had known so much sooner, because my life would have made much more sense for the past 20 years. I just was diagnosed about 2 years ago with EDS, and now my whole life makes more sense. And the dots are connected, and I feel validated. One of the things I talk about in the book is just my story, my path towards diagnosis, and the kind of funny relationship we have with diagnosis in general. And understandably, people want to avoid that labeling, because sometimes it leads to limitations or to a narrative about, I can't XYZ. And I talk about how liberating and validating it was for me to be diagnosed, because I finally sat down with the geneticist, and after seeing countless people right over the years, countless people who just never understood, never really were able to validate. When I sat down with that geneticist, he was like, oh, this is a classic case of hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And like the feeling that I had when he said that, and he understood, and he wasn't thinking maybe I'm a little crazy, or maybe I'm making this up, or da 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 da. I just can't put words to how powerful that was and how much it has liberated me as far as like moving forward with life in new ways. I don't see it as a limitation at all. So, and that was kind of surprising, but so much of the research for the book has been, continues to be validating and enlightening. And just, my hope with the book is that it saves some people from some of the confusion and the wondering that I spent so many years doing, wondering, is this how everyone feels? Like, is this how fatigued everyone is? Because chronic fatigue is usually a part of it too. Just that wondering, you just don't know what other people's experience is like. So that's been really nice. And earlier on, you asked, what should someone do if they suspect they may have a hypermobility syndrome? So I mentioned a geneticist, seeing a medical geneticist could be one thing, but just ask your doctor about it, and the problem is there aren't a lot of medical practitioners who have a lot of awareness about these things. So that's a challenge. But hopefully you find one who's open to learning, and helping you to find resources, and you build a team of practitioners who can help. Physical therapy is often sort of at this forefront because a lot of the musculoskeletal symptoms are what really catches people's attention. And having a PT who understands hypermobility is important because there's often some differences in exercise tolerance and recovery and nutritional needs and all that kind of stuff. People often get, they'll say, well, I'm trying to do strength training, but I get so sore. Yeah, they get extra sore. And that's part of why they have to be progressed really slowly and mindfully so that they can stay with it and be comfortable with it. So all of that stuff, it would be, looking at some resources around nutrition as well. There's a lot of good resources online. Again, it can be hard to find medical practitioners who understand. And I went through the same gauntlet that so many people do. I saw a lot of specialists and well-meaning people who just didn't have it on their radar.
Right. Well, I think, oh, sorry.
No, they just kept missing it over and over.
Yeah. I think this is amazing that you then took all of this experience as a PT, as a yoga teacher, as someone who was diagnosed with hypermobility, and you're working on this book, and probably by the time this goes out, the book will be almost ready or pre-order ready. And what a gift, because you sifted through all of the information. I mean, that's a huge thing. Thank you for doing this work. And
you're welcome. I hope it's helpful to people, whether bendy or not. As yoga teachers, I guarantee you see it all the time. And one of the things that's so interesting about the yoga setting is that hypermobility is everywhere, and it's so common that it looks normal to people. So that the yoga teacher who is used to visually seeing hypermobile students just comes to see that as standard human movement, and doesn't recognize that, wow, this is actually excessive human movement. So there may be some other issues here, and the yoga teacher is actually in the position to help connect some dots for people, and not in an alarmist kind of way, like, oh my God, this is really bad. It's actually not really bad. It's not bad at all. And the injury risk is there, but again, it's like, I think it's overplayed. I think the risk of injury is overplayed around hypermobility. It's certainly there, and we need to be aware of it. But what's underplayed is how useful yoga can be for this population in terms of slowing down, smaller movements, even sequencing, how we use verbal cues, how we use hands-on assists, all of those things. It's like, it's the gold mine for bendy practitioners, actually.
Oh my gosh. That is so good to know that we don't have to say, okay, you're bendy, you can't go to yoga anymore. You just have to hang out in the gym. It's quite the opposite.
No, that's like the worst thing. That's
Right.
like the worst thing. But it's a place for, okay, I'm bendy. Oh, let's do some inquiry around this. Let's learn about this. And let's see, is my yoga practice right now serving me, or is it kind of like adding to my troubles? And if it's adding to my troubles, let's change it. But let's not stop practicing. Let's just practice more wisely in a way that makes you feel better and not worse.
You just said something earlier as well, and I want to come back to this because I think it's very important what you said in that if we're a yoga teacher, we look around in a group class, we're seeing the bendiest of the population there in our class.
Yeah,
And then that person who walks in and is really having a hard time getting into child's pose, and you think, you really need to work on your mobility or your flexibility. And it could be that everyone else in the class is hypermobile.
exactly.
That's
That's
quite
the little
shocking.
That's a little bit of a mind twist. It's like our perception of human movement, when all we have really observed, or most of what we've observed, is in a yoga setting, gets really skewed. And then when you start to actually just see normal humans moving, you're like, you might think, wow, they're really tight, right? Or they're really limited. But actually, they're just demonstrating what's considered normal for human bodies. And so many of our verbal cues will reflect that, where we'll say, whatever, in a pigeon pose, line up your shin parallel to the front of your mat. And the only people who can actually do that are people with excessive hip range of motion. That's not something that normal people should be expected to do. So when you have that whole range of human movement in your class, then the people who are more around normal range of motion, they're just like, oh darn, I must not be good at yoga because I can't do this pose and all that. So they get really unfortunate messaging, because they're not displaying excessive range of motion.
Right. So this is really to serve all of our students, not just the hypermobile
Yes,
ones.
I
Oh,
think so. I think so. And I really think, hopefully the book also helps people just reflect on, what is it that our verbal cues and our language, what is it that we're encouraging, and what are we emphasizing in our teaching without maybe even realizing it? And how can we refine the language to reflect more what we understand yoga to care about, which isn't range of motion, right? Asana practice. I mean, we all know that. It's a no-brainer. Of course, you know that if you're a yoga teacher, but does your language really reflect that? Or are you still using language that encourages people to go farther? And if so, why is it better to go farther? Just why? What's
yes.
functionally useful about going farther for anybody, right? I mean, if someone, can't get their shoes on because they're so limited, well, then yeah, we should work on that. But that's usually not the case in a yoga setting.
This is so good. Thank you for all of this today. Where do our listeners go if they want to connect with you further and order your book?
So they can go to my website, which is libbyhinsley.com. And my book is, depends on when this airs. So my book is called Yoga for Bendy People, and it should be available for purchase on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc., around June or July of 2022.
Okay.
Okay. In the meantime, there's no way to pre-order it unless you happen to, hear this like now, overhear our conversation now in the next few weeks. I'm in the middle of a pre-sale campaign to pre-sell enough books to publish in a community-based publishing kind of model. So, so you can just search Yoga for Bendy People, and I'll have information about it on my website at libbyhinsley.com. And you can find me on Instagram, Libby Hinsley PT. That's where most of my action happens in terms of social media.
That's great. Thank you so much again, Libby. This has been great.
Thanks for having me.